If your blocks ever come out a little unintentionally wonky, or your borders start to ripple, or your quilt top or flimsy just won't lie flat, you are definitely not alone. These are some of the most common challenges that I heard about when I invited my subscribers to send me their quilting questions. Why do my blocks come out skewed or uneven, even though I was careful with my quarter-inch seam allowance? We'll start here, since there were multiple versions of this question. The truth is that bubbly fabric or uneven edges can happen even when you're sewing with a very careful, consistent quarter-inch seam allowance. Donna's question, what are the differences between the length and width or warp and weft of the fabric, also relate to grain line and how fabric behaves. So today I'll be sharing tips for understanding grain line and why it matters, pressing without stretching, avoiding rippling or wavy borders, and when to take a victory lap. We'll start with the lengthwise grain. This runs parallel to the selvage of the fabric. These are the warp threads. Fabric cut across the lengthwise grain or parallel to the selvage is the most stable and has very little stretch. The selvages are usually easy to spot as they're more tightly woven, don't fray, and may have pinholes from the manufacturing process. They may also be printed with the manufacturer designer or indicate the dyes used in the fabric. Tulip Pink's animal prints are especially fun. Next, the crosswise grain. This is the cut edge when fabric is cut off the bolt at the store. This is the weft. It runs across the width of the fabric, which for quilting weight cotton can vary from approximately 40 inches all the way to 45 inches. If you tug on a strip cut selvage to selvage on the crosswise grain, you'll notice that there is a little bit of stretch. And finally, the bias. True bias is along a 45-degree angle to the warp and weft, great for things like Celtic style applique or binding very sharp curves, but it can cause distortion to creep in when you're piecing or pressing. We'll get to some tips for getting around that potential danger shortly. Meanwhile, the important takeaway is if the outer edges of your block, border, or quilt top are on the lengthwise grain, it will be very stable. And on the crosswise grain, which is very common in quilting, it's still pretty stable as long as you're careful. But on the bias, stretchy. Depending on what we're making, this can be great, but it's not usually what we want for piecing. Carol from Rock Hill, South Carolina asked, how important is it to piece or applique along fabric grain lines? It seems to me that foundation paper piecing is not along grain lines at all. We'll come back to applique another day, but for now, let's look at an example of foundation paper piecing to see what Carol is referring to. Here's an in-progress shot of when I made the take wing pattern. Carol is absolutely correct. Thinking about grain line goes out the window. That's why foundations are so helpful. They stabilize all those bits of fabric and prevent them from stretching as we're working. A word of caution, though, if you're using paper or other tearaway foundation, be very careful not to stretch the fabric when you remove it. Let's look at a different scenario. Here are some of the Meadowland blocks I made from the pattern by Then Came June. But instead of this layout, I decided I wanted to add sashing and cornerstones between my blocks and set the blocks on point. This meant I needed to add setting triangles, while making sure to avoid placing stretchy bias edges on the outer edges of the quilt where it might cause the quilt to ripple. So I cut quarter square setting triangles to go along the sides of the quilt, which allowed me to avoid placing bias edges along the outer edges of the quilt. I cut half square setting triangles for the corners, again to avoid having bias on the outer edges of the quilt. It worked just great. Okay, let's talk pressing, since how you press can be just as important as how you cut. It can be part personal preferences and part strategy. Let's consider half square triangles. And as a side note, I'm using my silver pressing pad today, A wool mat or even a cloth-covered pressing mat can help with accurate pressing. The silver one can be a little bit slippery. Ironing, especially dragging the iron, can stretch the fabric. Can you see how the fabric is stretching and sliding? It's most likely to happen with bias edges, but it can happen on the cross grain too. Setting the seam by pressing with the fabrics in the same position they were in when you sewed them, and I often do this from the back side, can help the stitches sink down into the fabric and become less likely for the seam allowances to roll or flip. If I'm pressing towards the darker fabric, I find it helpful to use just the tip of the iron first, holding it on a slant to make sure there are no accidental pleats in the seam. And then I use the flat of the iron for the final pressing up and down, working with the grain of the fabric to help keep my block nice and square. When I'm piecing a quilt with high contrast fabrics like these, I press all my seams in the individual blocks towards the darker fabric whenever I can. But I may choose to press seams open when I join the blocks to prevent the darker fabrics from shadowing through the lighter ones when I sew my rows together. Here's a related question from Nancy. When pressing, I notice that often a seam in the half square triangle will fold over as I'm pressing the straight seams near it, which is frustrating. What do you do with the fraying and pressing seams in the finished top? Nancy sent this photo to illustrate. My answer is to mostly keep an eye out for any long, dark threads that might shadow through the light fabric and be visible on the front of the quilt, and watch out for threads that might be long enough to get caught in your seams and end up on the front of the quilt. And if you occasionally have a seam allowance that gets flipped or twisted, it's not usually a big deal to leave it, as long as it's not creating a noticeable lump on the front of the quilt. So I wouldn't worry about the one in the yellow oval, but I would definitely flatten out the intersection at the top of the red oval. That lump could cause problems for you when you're quilting. A quick tip: even beautifully sewn and pressed blocks can contribute to a slightly wonky quilt if the blocks don't all start out the same size. A quick measure and square up, and maybe a tiny trim before sewing rows together can save you so much frustration later. Now, if your quilt top is looking great, but suddenly develops waves or ripples when you add borders or binding, this next step might be where things went off the rails. Let's look at Donna's question. What makes the edges of the quilt ripple after I sew the binding on? The quilt was square and flat before. Well, there's multiple factors that could be at play. One reason borders might grow goes back to Grainline. In an ideal world, we'd always cut borders on the lengthwise grain parallel to the selvage, but that's not always a practical or economical choice, as it may take a lot more yardage. Instead, we may cut border strips selvage to selvage on the cross grain, joining strips as needed for length. This is perfectly fine. It just means we need to be a little extra careful not to stretch them, especially as we're sewing them. When cutting borders, I prefer to measure through the center of the quilt and cut opposite borders at the same time to the exact length. I start by pinning the ends and the middle, then in between those pins, and then between those, and so on. And that way, I don't end up with a weird bubble of excess border at the end of the quilt, or worse yet, a gap between the end of the border and the end of the quilt. This next consideration is one of those things I wish someone had told me when I first started out. It would have saved me a lot of frustration. The edges of the quilt top itself may have stretched, either because the fabric stretched a little bit or because the thread slipped out of the first couple of stitches at the beginning or end of the seams on the outer edges of blocks or rows. A victory lap can help with this. And thank you to Carrie for introducing me to that term. I've always just called it stay stitching. Either way, it's a line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the outer edges of the quilt top that can help stabilize the blocks and prevent the blocks from stretching or seams coming undone while handling it. Looking at Donna's photo, I love the Canadian themed fabrics, by the way, but I want to mention two other factors that might cause rippling borders. First, uneven density and or direction in the quilting. In this case, it looks like all the quilting in the borders is vertical, while the quilting in the body of the quilt is more horizontal. That could do it. And finally, quilters often unintentionally stretch the binding by pulling on it a little bit as they sew it to the quilt, which can cause the edges of the quilt to ripple later. This is even more likely when bias binding is used on a straight edge, but it can happen with cross-grain strips too. I hope today's video helps you understand what might be going on when your blocks are a little wonky or your borders start to wave. These small adjustments can make a big difference, and they're easy to apply right away. I do want to say, though, don't be too hard on yourselves. A quilt does not have to be perfect to be beautiful and wonderful and for you to enjoy using it. A huge thank you to everyone who submitted questions, photos, tips, and show and tell. I'll be featuring them in future Ask Beth Ann videos. And if you'd like to submit a quilting question, the easiest way is to reply to my weekly email newsletter. That lets you send photos and details, and it makes it simple for us to stay in touch. Thanks so much for being here, and happy quilting.